Hello, and welcome back to a new episode of Cultivate, which is the podcast of the Evergreen Association. And we are on site at our 2025 Leadership Retreat, and I am here today with one of our guest speakers who just spoke right before recording this, the Reverend Morgan Fletcher. So glad you're here today.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm really excited to get, more people to know about you, because I remember when I first met you a couple of annual meetings ago, you were a pastor at Calvary Baptist in Denver. And I visited your church, and it turned out that you were preaching, and I was like, this is an amazing preacher, amazing pastor, and the whole staff there are amazing. But you're onto new things right now in your life, and some people might not know you who are watching us right now. So I would love for you to introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your journey and what you're up to right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's great to be here. Calvary joined Evergreen a couple years ago, and it has been just a breath of creativity and excitement, and has been such a gift to that community there. So thank you so much. And for me, getting to be with you this weekend is a gift as well for a variety of reasons. But as you noted, I had previously been doing parish ministry, and I did 12 years of full-time parish ministry, 2 years at an Episcopal church in Austin, and 10 years at Calvary Baptist. I am also a trained social worker, and in kind of a discernment journey in 2023, began to explore how can I be well in that particular season of life. And for me, that meant leaving full-time parish ministry and finding ways to support clergy in different ways. So I started Present Nomads, and Present Nomads is designed to do what I call free-range pastoring, meaning I can support other pastors and lay leaders as they seek to be well. Because sometimes we have to bring in others to alleviate some of the other tasks or responsibilities, whether for a short period or a long period of time. And then through coaching and consulting, helping folks kind of follow one train of thought to the next, and how do we actually create action around that. And then I just recently started my therapy practice. And I specialize in religious trauma and spiritual harm, which is, not super exciting, but super important when it comes to how do we allow the divine within to be well. And sometimes that means being able to talk to a therapist who understands church language and who also is a survivor of religious harm. And so through that, I get to do many things, but all of them come back to the cornerstone of well-being. How do we help folks be well, whether on leave or through a discernment process, or the fact that they may not be able to afford a full-time associate, but they need somebody to do some of the work of the associate. Maybe they're structuring things differently and need an outside voice. Or maybe they're actually looking at that internal work of how to be well and wanting therapeutic resources to partner with them. But it was my kids and my husband who were my sages to exploring my own well-being. And we live in a suburb of Denver, and so being here in wood and water is just so life-giving. So exploring some of that. And then on the side, I am an adjunct faculty in the Diana Garland School of Social Work, which is my alma mater. And it's one of those where I get to teach and still preach some. I get to engage in community practice and clinical practice. So for me, Present Nomads is how I get to be present within myself while knowing and exploring what comes next, which is essentially the story behind the name Present Nomads.
That's great. I mean, one of the first things that was really exciting when I got to know you is just like how multifaceted you are, but it's very integrated. It's not these separate worlds, but like the teaching, the pastoral aspect, the counseling, it all kind of comes together in a very unique way. And that's why I really want to work with you, because As I mentioned earlier in the retreat, is that I've been trying to listen to our region. And one of the things that came up often was this sense of like overwhelm of how do we do this, like, looking for solutions and almost feeling like I don't know how to find solutions. It wasn't just solutions like strategically, but it was also like internally, like to find wellness. And I think that was what was really interesting meeting you, is because I think you bring that all together. Like the strategy isn't this abstract, like performance efficiency thing. It's about like wellness, well-being. And I thought that was really interesting. And so I'm really glad that we're working together, because this has been why we brought you into the retreat, but maybe you could kind of talk to us in this episode a bit about well-being. Because I feel like all pastors know, like, yeah, I want to be well, of course. Like I want to not feel bad, I don't want to be struggling. But it's amazing how consistently you're finding pastors, if you get them to speak candidly, like they're in a very difficult state, whatever that might be. And I feel, with the current administration, a lot of our pastors who are, serving people on the margins, just feeling overwhelmed by what's at stake. The voice of the church just feels really in question, and being clergy, we're trying to do what we feel God's calling us to do, but then we feel like we're being misunderstood a lot, or being aligned with things that we don't believe in at all. Like all of that combined, it's a lot. And we don't want to be in those awful feeling places, but we get to where we are. And I was wondering, what do you think are some of the main ways that prevent us from being well? Because obviously we want it, but like what's kind of keeping us from like finding that?
Yeah, it's a good question on a variety of levels. I would say first and foremost, it's unique to everybody. Because if you're serving in a church, your church is not like any other church. There's going to be similarities, right? But the ethos as well as the praxis within that institution and community is unique. I think the threads I see across care professions, and pastoring is one of those professions, is this belief that I can't be well until those I am caring for are well. Otherwise, it's selfishness. And so that creates a buffer of I just have to keep giving and serving and doing with and for, depending on the situation, the people that have been entrusted to me, at the risk of my own assessment of well-being. And when that is where we begin, it is so hard to start that assessment of what actually would make me well. And it's a question that I think we ask children and yet stop once we reach kind of like teen years. Because as kids, right, mine are almost 5, one turns 5 next week, and the other is like 3.5. If they are struggling, I'm like, okay, are you hungry? Are you tired? Are you needing focus time from me? What is helping the unwell expressions of behavior right now? And as we get into adulthood, I think we stop asking that of ourselves and each other, because we should just conform to what is expected of us, what is required of us, and anything else, you're maybe too soft or too weak of a person. And so when we're not given that practice, it's really hard to actually know how to be well. And I think churches have a large misconception of what being a pastor is, and that it's not that hard of a job. And I think that perpetuates also that if a pastor starts saying, I'm not well, or I need this to be well, they don't have the same starting point, because the congregation's going, dude, you preach on Sunday. What do you do during the week except hospital visits? Exactly, right? And so when you're starting from different origins of a conversation, you're going to continue to miss each other. And the energy, as you spoke at last night's session so beautifully, when energy doesn't feed us, when we feel misunderstood, it's sometimes just easier to coast and not engage that work because it is painful to not be understood. So I would say it's the twofold of it's not practiced, and a lot of our congregations and pastors are starting the conversation at different points that we don't want to expend the minimal energy we have on addressing our own well-being. And so that's a struggle there.
That brings up a good point because, I think what adds to the difficulty of this conversation is that there's this whole literally industry, wellness industry, right? There is a commodification of like trying to get well. Yeah. And so that definition of well gets really confused, right? With capitalism. And I remember we were talking and I said, well, hey, maybe we should create some wellness cohorts.
Yeah.
And, you thoughtfully said, I think we need to be careful of using the word wellness because of where it is in society right now. Yeah. And we want to change the name to well-being cohort. Mm-hmm. In retrospect, I think that was a lot of wisdom. Like I learned a lot from that because once you said that and you named it, I kind of looked around and said, I totally see what you're saying. Mm-hmm. There is a confusion between wellness and when we talk about well-being. Yeah. And I was wondering, could you help maybe kind of clarify like the distinction between the two?
For me, wellness is an external piece, right? So like the wellness industry, there's supplements, there's classes, there's diets, like whatever, it's all external. So we, as you said, purchase and commodify the wellness. Well-being is that internal, I called it in the session, our divine right to be well. That from the very beginning, we were created to live life abundantly, not just survive or struggle, but to thrive and flourish. And that should not be a privilege, right? It shouldn't be our socioeconomics. It shouldn't be where we geographically live, but that it is a inherent piece of who we are. And part of engaging our well-being is helping to remove some of those barriers and blockades to our well-being. So for me, that's the key difference is wellness tends to be external. It can impact our inside, right? But it's a different origin point. So wellness is outside of ourselves and we're going to it, whereas well-being already dwells within us and we are releasing it outwards.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I feel like when you're talking to more modern practitioners of wellness, they're even admitting like, hey, there needs to be a more holistic approach. Like my sister is a naturopathic doctor, and we recognize you can only do so much with the external, right? We need to go deeper. But then, like, what is the framework that's guiding that, right? And then I think if we even go internal, I think, external is included. You need to have the right framework guiding it to really find that, shalom that God desires for us all. And I think that's kind of what is unique about the work that you're doing because you're so integrated. Like you have this kind of clinical training, right? You know about like neuroscience and stuff like that, but then you also have this kind of spiritual grounding through your pastoral practices and such. I wonder if you could maybe just like, what are some things that you feel like when you're talking generally, like what is one thing that we could do to get us on a journey of well-being? Like, is there something that you often refer to help people like, this is a good way to get started?
You mean like we as the universal we, or like we as Evergreen?
I think both would be very interesting to me, actually. Okay. Now that you said that, it's like, actually, I'd like to hear about both.
I'll start with the universal we.
Yeah.
So for me, the biggest piece is knowing how our body's wisdom communicates. So we have several nervous systems, and they manifest in different ways. And so beginning to get curious about how our nervous system is activated and how to be in partnership with our nervous system versus trying to fight our nervous system responses. And by that, I mean, before, if I would get agitated or angry because of an injustice, I would completely ignore that my heart rate was up, that my breathing was short, that, depending on how significant of an injustice, especially if it was towards one of my students, that mama bear mentality, I wouldn't even know that like my muscles had tightened and tensed and that shoulders were, right, like that my body was responding. I just went into action. And now that desire to go into action and protect is still there, but I have learned my responses and my nervous system a bit to where I can actively go, okay, does this student even want me to intervene on their behalf? Right. I am doing what feels right to me, but what about them? Or, okay, if I go in and speak without intention, I may then regret and cause greater harm. And so by learning my nervous system responses, I give myself a longer runway to engage. Right. And that longer runway internally may feel like 5 minutes, right. But in reality, it could be even 2 seconds. But when we begin to understand our nervous system responses, we can actively use the wisdom of what our body is telling us to go, oh, on a regular, I am activated by this behavior. I'm not in a space to be able to engage that behavior, so I need to adjust how I engage or how I am present. So that, I would say, is kind of an overall, if we begin to learn to our body's wisdom, instead of getting upset that that's how we react or trying to just ignore and power through, it allows us to, our bodies are so wise. And at least in the Western thought I was brought up in, the mind is one thing, the body is another, and you kind of ignore both depending on what is before you. Yeah. And so for me, the somatic work of paying attention to my body has been a huge piece. Yeah. And it's available to all of us. That's the other reason, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in that. I was just thinking about a story I had with a spiritual director once, mm-hmm. and I was talking about how, because I grew up in a Korean tradition where you have to wake up really early in the morning and pray for hours, and that's a sign of true devotion. And I tell my spiritual directors, I just struggle, every time I'm praying, I fall asleep, and I just keep trying and trying, but I keep falling asleep. And my director was just very blunt and just said, well, what do you think that's telling you, yeah. right? And he's like, it sounds like you're tired, and then he said, maybe you should get some sleep. Yeah. But in my mind, I was like, that's the last thing I want to do, right? Because for me, I was programmed, I got to fight through this sleep, yeah. right? I don't want to fall asleep on God or something. But
you didn't have enough discipline,
right.
of critique.
Right, and just to have that kind questioning that you're talking mm-hmm. about, right? That exploratory questioning, mm-hmm. I think is really big. And then the other thing I was thinking of is that, Jesus even says what fruits are being generated, right? The fruits of the mm-hmm. Spirit, right? What fruit is coming from this tree? Mm-hmm. And we just don't read the signs. Right? Yeah. And because we feel like we know better. Yeah. Everything's falling apart, but it's good. I know better, sure. right? Yeah. I guess our stubbornness is probably a lot of our obstacle.
I think some of it's stubbornness. I think some of it is also all we know.
Right, yeah.
And you can only do with what you know.
Yeah, right.
Especially if the models, I grew up in a similar model where it was, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, then whatever you experience is your fault because you just should have tried harder. That's a guilt and shame model. And when we get stuck in guilt and shame, right, pastors know this well, it doesn't lead to love and peace and forgiveness. And so we get stuck, and I think that's the hard piece, right? So your earlier question around the we of Evergreen, I think as an association to normalize not being well. And I don't mean that's the expectation, but normalize it in the sense of, yeah, we're going to be unwell at times. The world is hard and complicated, and it is pivoting very quickly. And so if we can ground ourselves in our well-being, we can handle when we're not well. And to normalize that for folks to say, especially as Evergreen staff, this in a way that we don't just as participating churches. Just like a pastor does of their congregants, how many are unwell. And so to be able to invest in them the way you are, I think is a key piece. And to normalize that it's okay if you're not well. It is not a reflection of your leadership. It is not a reflection of your ministry. And how can we get curious with you about what would help you to support your well-being? I didn't say this in the session we just came out of, but I think you can be well and unwell and your well-being be grounded, right? Because it's that divine spark within us that if I know who I am internally and support that well-being, I can oscillate between well and unwell. And I think as a region, normalizing that across the fact that there's so many different cultures and practices allows each culture to respond authentically within their own context. And for the pastor to go, okay, I don't have to pretend that I'm okay when I'm not. And you all are going to be the people they name that to.
So maybe to close our time, I mean, there's so many things more I want to talk about. We'll just get you on again. But maybe you could share a bit about this pilot program that you and I are working on. I mean, just, a thumbnail sketch, because we'll have links later for it. Yeah. But could you tell us a bit about the well-being cohort that we're working on?
Yeah. It is a up to 6 people kind of cohort, so it's pretty small, intentionally designed so that they get focus support from me. So I'm the guide or practitioner for the cohort. And there's an intake goal setting session, 4 individual one-on-one sessions, a 45-minute, exit action planning session, and then 2 90-minute group sessions together. And the hope with that is that because our well-being is so unique to each of us, that I am partnering with them as a unique individual. So they will be utilizing their wisdom around what goals they want to engage and set before them and kind of explore. And my job is to ask curious questions, get into wonderment with them, and to really kind of see what might need to pivot or adjust or change. And if in one of those sessions, it becomes clear that it's like a systematic piece to their congregation, that's the beauty of Evergreen, because Numa can partner and offer resources to them, right? So I would say while this cohort is more internally focused, if there is a communal external focus, because it's part of Evergreen, there's already helpful partnerships that are established and can be allocated and utilized. And then each participant will get $500 of seed exploration, because when things don't change, it's hard for us to see how we could adjust aspects of practice or self to try something new for the sake of our well-being, especially if we've never been taught that that's okay. So there's a bit of seed money just for you to try and explore. My hope is to offer support and encouragement. So while it won't be therapy, I have therapeutic wisdom. While it won't be pastoring, I have pastoral insights to help with language and understanding context and ministry. And the hope is to really be a pastoral accompaniment as they explore their well-being.
Wonderful. Yeah, I feel like in this time and age, it's the challenge of pastoring. The stakes are so high. Yeah. And just to know that there are things like this to support pastors in their work is so key. So, so grateful for you.
So grateful for you all.
Yeah, it's been great. We hope you would consider this work that we're doing and what's to come. So thank you for joining us. Be sure to subscribe, like the videos, share them with people. I think there's a lot of great wisdom here that would be very beneficial for a lot of folks. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you soon.